Hey everybody, hope you're all well. I thought the exam went pretty well. Um, yeah, I hope everyone's beard is coming in nicely. And I thought we would move forward into chapter 10, which is concerned with pricing strategies for firms that have market power. So that really means, given what we've done so far, we're really talking about monopolies, firms that can have some influence over the prices they charge. And not so much related to competitive firms. There's a nice figure in um, the textbook that I want to talk about because it kind of lays this out nicely in terms of sort of how this works with the which strategies apply in which cases. So we start with the question: does a firm have market power? If the answer is no, then it's in a competitive market. There's no need for a pricing strategy in a competitive market. You simply charge for your product what the market price is. Does the firm have market power? Well, yes. We ask, can the firm prevent resale and arbitrage? So what do those mean? So, well, resale is obvious. You buy the product from the firm maybe and sell it to someone else. And arbitrage means that you're charging a higher price when you sell it than what you paid for it. So examples of arbitrage that are common have to do with tickets for various kinds of entertainment, sporting events, and other things, where someone will go and buy tickets from the original seller and then resell them at a higher price. And that's called arbitrage when you resell at a higher price. Sometimes it's difficult to do that with a product. Um, when I was younger, when I was your age, you could buy a plane ticket and give it to somebody else. And there was very little security at airports. And as long as you had a ticket, you could get on a plane. That's no longer the case. Even before TSA was created, during the 1990s, airlines became stricter about checking IDs and making sure that the name on the ticket matched the name on your ID. They said that was about security. It was probably at least as much about preventing resales, um, which had at one point was a common thing. So, can the firm prevent resale and arbitrage? If the answer is no, if what they're doing is selling a product that you can turn around and resell like a ticket, then the firm is simply going to price as a monopoly, setting marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, as we've seen. And this is what happens in Chapter 9. Can the firm prevent resale and arbitrage? Well, if the answer is yes, then we have to ask, do the firm's customers have different demand curves? If the firms are all the same, I'm sorry, if the customers are all the same, then there's really no clear strategy or clear advantage to price discrimination, although there is some. We'll talk about that. So the firms have different demand curves. If the answer is no, we can talk about things like block pricing and two-part tariffs, which are actually fairly common. Do they have different demand curves? Yes. Can the firm identify the different demands? Well, if the firm has information about each customer, then they can engage in first-degree price discrimination. If they only have information about groups of customers and not about individuals, then they can do what's called third-degree price discrimination. Can they identify customers directly? Well, no. They might be able to do what's called second-degree price discrimination. We'll talk about that. We won't spend too much time on bundling. And again, block pricing and two-part tariffs are things that you can do when you can't identify who has which demand. So as we work through this, I would encourage you to refer back to this picture just to keep yourself organized in terms of how this all works, how it all fits together. All right. So let's talk, we'll start with first-degree price discrimination. So first-degree price All right. So, what are the requirements for first-degree price discrimination? Well, the firm has to have some market power. It has some ability to control its pricing. You have to have differing demands for consumers. I'm going to say from consumers, just to be clear that it's the consumers who have the demand. And the firm has perfect and complete information about consumer demands. Okay, so that third assumption, perfect and complete information about consumer demand, that seems like a pretty high bar, and it is. But let's think about this. Suppose we have a firm that is a monopoly, and so this is the demand that it faces. Okay. If this were just a traditional monopoly that didn't have this information about individual demands, it would have a marginal revenue that looks like this. We're going to assume that this firm has a constant marginal cost. This is not a crucial assumption. It just makes the pictures easier to draw and makes our pictures a little bit easier to understand. So if this were a traditional monopoly, we would expect the firm to sell that quantity and do so at this price. That's monopoly price. Okay. And it does that when it can't figure out who its consumers are along this demand curve. But imagine that the firm did have information about each consumer. And what it knows is that there's some consumer who's willing to pay much more than the market price. Okay. Right now, this consumer only pays PM. They'd be willing to pay much more than that. And the fact that they only pay PM means that they end up with this area of consumer surplus. But if the firm could figure out who was willing to pay this price, they could charge this price. And they'd sell to that one person at this price. And then they could figure out who's willing to pay a slightly lower price and sell to that person. And what they're doing is this consumer surplus up here, they're transferring it from consumers to the firm. The firm is getting everybody to pay the highest price they possibly can. And what they do is they keep on doing that, and they charge everybody the highest price they're willing to pay until they get down to here to marginal cost. And in the end, what they end up with is this entire area becomes producer surplus. And so the firm benefits tremendously from being able to charge each consumer the highest price they're willing to pay. Is this possible? It's pretty difficult to do. We can think of examples where firms try to accomplish this. Think about traditionally buying a car as a face-to-face interaction where you go in and you have some idea of the maximum amount you're willing to pay. That's not the amount that you offer, because this is typically a bargaining process. You may go in and offer a much lower price. And what the firm tries to do, what the auto dealer tries to do, is to figure out exactly what this number is for you and to push you up as high as close to that figure as they possibly can. They get to practice this many times a day. Most consumers don't do it very often. And so the firms tend to be pretty good at getting you to pay something closer to your maximum price. Okay. So that's first-degree price discrimination, and all the benefit then goes to the firm. And what this means is that the firm, instead of having this area as its total revenue, which it would with monopoly pricing, it means that this entire area then becomes its total revenue. So with much greater total revenue, its total cost is the area under the marginal cost curve, and so the producer surplus in the end is equal to the firm's economic profit. Okay. All right. That's first degree price discrimination. Third degree price discrimination is next. You might wonder why we're not doing second degree next. Typically, third degree is considered the most basic type of price discrimination, the most common type. So we usually talk about this one before second degree. I don't know who is in charge of numbering them, but perhaps when they put you in charge, you can renumber. So in any case, third degree price discrimination, what does it require? Market power on the part of the firm. It requires no resales. Okay, because what we're going to end up doing here is charging firms different prices for the good, or charging consumers rather different prices for the good. And if consumers have different prices, then it's going to defeat the ability of consumers to resell a good and engage in arbitrage. We have to assume that there are differing demands by group. So there are different groups of consumers, and those different groups have differing demands, and the firm, we assume, can identify the differing groups' demands. So what does it look like? So what we're going to do is we're going to say this. Suppose we split the market up among these different types of consumers. This, by the way, this approach, third degree price discrimination, is sometimes referred to as market segmentation, which is a nice descriptive term for what we're going to do. We're going to split the market into segments, one for each group. So let's just suppose that we have two groups of consumers in this market. And we'll just call them group 1 and group 2. And let's suppose that there's a single demand for the good. And sorry, that's a mistake. I'm drawing the demands to be the same, but the demands are supposed to differ. So we're going to ignore that, and I'll move down the page and we'll try again. Just hoping to get a good focus here. All right. So here's group 1's demand, and here's group 2. There we go. And now we want to draw group 1 and group 2 with differing demands. So let's suppose that group 1's demand looks like this, and maybe group 2 has a demand that looks like this. Okay, so one is quite elastic and one is inelastic. And let's suppose that the firm has a single manufacturing process which has the same marginal cost for everything they make. And what the firm is going to do here then is simply to treat these different segments as though they were different markets altogether, as though they were different firms. And so the firm will find marginal revenue in each case. That's ugly. Set marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. I really don't like this picture. This is a problem with using pen instead of chalk. So with apologies, I'm going to redraw that picture. Okay, so we have one segment of the market that looks like this, and another segment that maybe has a demand curve that is very inelastic. Marginal revenue, and we'll put in the same marginal cost in both cases. Okay, sorry about that. And now what the firm is going to do, this is group 1 and group 2 of consumers. What the firm is going to do is to treat these as though they were separate markets and maximize profit independently in these two cases. So in the first case, that's going to be the quantity for group 1, and they're going to be charged a price like P1. Here's the quantity for group 2, and group 2 gets charged a higher price like P2. Okay, and so in this case, the firm is discriminating by maximizing profit for the two groups. Why do they do this? Because they can't look at consumers individually and figure out whether they belong to group 1 or group 2, but they know there are two different groups that behave a little bit differently. One has a more inelastic demand, one has a more elastic demand. What are examples of markets where firms use third-degree price discrimination to charge different prices? Well, you might think about movie theaters, right, where people who have more elastic demand are the people who go in the afternoon, who have more control over when they go to see a movie, and the people who go at night have a less elastic demand. They really are more limited in their ability to choose the time they see it. And so if you go at night, you're going to pay a higher price than if you go in the middle of the afternoon. To some extent, airlines do this by charging different prices depending on when you buy your ticket. Most leisure travelers will buy ahead of time, and they'll end up paying a lower price. If you're a business traveler, you're likely to buy on short notice, 1 or 2 days in advance, and you're likely to pay a much higher price for a ticket. Okay, but again, the consumer or the firm can't tell exactly who you are until you sort of reveal your behavior, either by showing up in the afternoon or by buying a ticket a day or two in advance. So that's third-degree price discrimination. Okay. Second-degree price discrimination again requires that the firm have market power. There's no resale. Okay. Differing demands by groups. But in this case, the firm does not know which consumers are in which group. Okay, so let me just write this. So when we talk about third-degree price discrimination, consumers reveal which group they're in by their behavior, either by showing up in the afternoon to see a movie, by buying a ticket a day in advance if they're a business traveler. In this case, in the case of second-degree price discrimination, firms don't get that clue. They really can't tell who's who. And so they need a different way to separate the consumers into different groups. And so what they're going to do is to use quantity discounts to get consumers to self-identify. Okay. And here's the idea. Again, we'll split this market into two groups. This is a different sort of market segmentation approach, but again, we're segmenting the market into the different groups. And in this case, though, it's much more difficult to figure out who's in which group. So let's suppose we have two groups, and one group has a demand that's strong and inelastic, and another group has a demand that is much more elastic. Okay. Again, we'll assume constant marginal cost. Since it's a single firm, this is why it's easier to use a constant marginal cost, because if you're going to split the marginal cost across two firms, it's easier to hold that marginal cost constant, make it the same in the two firms. If it's upward sloping, it's much more difficult to do that. Okay. So what we're going to do is to offer a discount to these consumers. Okay. And here's how we're going to do it. In each section of the market, we can think about where the marginal revenue is. And in this case, here's price in segment 1. So this is for group 1, and this is group 2. And in this case, we'd like to offer a lower price for these consumers. Call this Q2 and price P2. Okay. And so what we want to do is this. We're going to say the offer that we make to consumers is anyone can buy at price P2, the lower price, that's less than price P1, as long as they buy at least Q2 units of the good, where Q2 is larger than Q1. Okay. And so we offer this discount only for large quantities. Now, the way I've drawn this picture, it's not clear to me exactly how this is going to work out. I'm going to have to fudge it a little bit, but you'll get the idea. So these consumers would love to pay the lower price P2, but if they buy less than this quantity, they're only going to get the higher price P1. What we're trying to do as a firm is to separate the consumers, to get consumers to self-reveal. So what we need to do is to set these prices up in a way that gets the consumers to, in fact, self-reveal. So let's think about what would happen for these consumers if they buy enough to qualify for the lower price. So let me just bring P2 across here. And let's suppose that this then is quantity Q2. So these consumers would be required to purchase this amount to get price P2. For these consumers, paying the lower price would add consumer surplus for them in that amount. This is added consumer surplus because for these units, they're paying less than the maximum amount they'd be willing to pay. But for the units beyond the demand curve, to the right of where that price hits the demand curve, they're paying more than the maximum they'd be willing to pay. And so this is really sort of negative consumer surplus. Here they're paying more than the maximum they'd be willing to pay. And so this is reduced consumer surplus. Okay. So what we need, so for this to work, for the firm, for this to work, the added consumer surplus must be less than the reduced consumer surplus. Why? If these consumers are to get the lower price, they're going to have to buy more than they would prefer. If what that does is to overall reduce the consumer surplus, then they're not going to do this. Okay? If they're going to get less consumer surplus total by paying the lower price and buying a larger quantity, they're not going to like that. They'll stick with the lower quantity and the higher price. On the other hand, if this reduction in consumer surplus is smaller than what's added, then they will go ahead and buy more. Okay? So if these people, this group, is willing to purchase more of the good at the lower price, then there's no price discrimination because they'll be getting the lower price just as this group is getting the lower price. This only results in price discrimination in separating the groups for the firm as long as they can get this group to pay the higher price and the other group to pay the lower price. That's second-degree price discrimination. I'm going to stop here and I'll pick up in a few minutes.